When I think about Jewish history, one name that comes to mind is Arnold Toynbee, a great historian of the 20th century, whose perspective on the Jews was that we were a living fossil. And, the word fossil or fossilized, in fact, is the exact term used by Toynbee. And it's always been a mystery to me to understand how he could reach such a conclusion when, looking back over the arc of Jewish history over 30 or 35 centuries, what we see is a constant evolution and change within Judaism that reflected the intersection, assimilation, acculturation between the Jewish core and the outside world in which the Jewish community lived. And clearly, this is a history of a vital community. And this acculturation, assimilation goes back to the very beginning of the recorded history of the Jewish people. When you look at manifestations of this acculturation, such as names, language, dress, cultural norms, values, philosophy, we find multiple examples of this assimilation repeated over and over. Going back to the period of slavery in Egypt, names that we think of as Jewish names, Moses, Aaron, Hophni, Phineas, are all names that were derived from the Egyptian. In the biblical period, the same kind of influence. Remember, the gods around worshiped by the people were, hang on, somebody wants to come in. Good. The peoples around the Jewish communities in the land of Israel worship Baal. And what Jewish names do we have from this period? We have names like Ishbaal, Daniel, Zerubbabel. In the Hashmonean period, after the Greek conquest in 329 BCE, typical Greek names came to represent important Jewish leaders: Jason, Apollonimus, Alexander, Aristobulus, Hyrcanus, Tryphon. And in Latin Europe, rabbis had names like Vidal, Bonfils, and Peter. And along with these outward manifestations of acculturation, were significant changes in the beliefs and how Judaism was explained and promoted, and the languages which were used for this purpose. You know, when in Hebrew school, we all learn lex talionis, ayin tachat ayin, shein tachat shein, eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And this was explained away as just not really to be read literally, that in fact, lex talionis was about paying compensation for the loss of an eye, a tooth, or some other part of your anatomy. But the reality is, when lex talionis was drafted, it represented a dramatic change in the way law was applied. It was an example of treating everyone equal under the law. Because when lex talionis was drafted, it literally meant an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, because before its promulgation, if you were rich, you paid compensation. If you were poor, you lost an eye or a tooth or a hand or a leg or whatever was the part of your anatomy for which justice was being demanded. When in Hebrew school, we learned about the Tanakh saying that, the Torah in particular saying that a disobedient son was to be punished by taking him to the gates of the city and stoning him to death. And again, just as lex talionis was explained away with an entirely different meaning than was intended when it was written, treatment of a disobedient son was also explained away as just a way of warning children to behave, and no one carried it out. And if you look at Leviticus and try to understand Leviticus, there's a section that deals with how you treat rape. And if there is a rape involving a betrothed woman, and it takes place in the countryside, according to Leviticus, the rapist the rapist is put to death, and the betrothed woman is accepted into the community accepted back into the community. If, however, this rape takes place in the city, according to Leviticus, the rapist is killed and the betrothed woman is killed. And the rationale for this is the fact that if the rape took place in the city and it was truly a rape and not consensual, then the woman would have cried out, someone would have heard and come to her assistance and aid. And if you really want to understand what life was like in biblical time when these kind of dictums were drafted, how you handle a rape case, what you do with a disobedient son. If you want some sort of living insight to that, you should take a look at Arab societies that have highly developed shame and honor codes. I grew up in learning that the core value of Judaism was pikuach nefesh, the saving, the preservation of human life. In fact, halachically speaking, virtually every rabbinic law it falls by the wayside because of the importance of pikuach nefesh. Yet in these Arab societies with highly developed shame and honor codes, honor, the family's honor, becomes predominant. If you have a daughter who disgraces your family honor, it is your responsibility to kill her, to restore the family honor. If your wife does something that disgraces the family honor, your responsibility is to kill her. And if your son, for example, is gay, your job is to kill your brother or your son in order to restore the family honor. A decade ago, the weekend magazine of Haaretz had this phenomenally interesting article that was the most Kafkaesque real-world story I remembered reading at the time. It was a story about a young man from a West Bank village who was gay. And he brought his American boyfriend back to the village and passed him off as his business partner. And of course, after a while, the village figured out what was going on. And this young gay Arab from the West Bank fled to Tel Aviv. And he fled to Tel Aviv because at least there he wouldn't have brothers looking to kill him. In fact, Mishmar HaGvul managed to intercept this young man's brothers who were infiltrating into Israel, not for the purpose of random acts of violence or terrorism, but they were infiltrating into Israel for the objective of finding their brother and killing him to restore the family honor. And this young man in Tel Aviv was, caught in the most incredible Kafkaesque world. He couldn't stay in Tel Aviv because he didn't have a permit. He couldn't go back to his village because he would be killed. He couldn't get to the United States because they wouldn't grant him a visa because he was considered a security risk. And so if you want to understand what life was like in this early biblical period, look into societies that have continued to preserve those kind of values even until today. But Judaism, on the other hand, moved far from those values, and that represented the constant and continuous over time acculturation, assimilation of valuable insights into the core of what became Judaism at different points in time. In the First Temple period, Jews had, I use the term Jews loosely because Jews as we use the term today, of course, didn't exist. There were Israelites and there were Judeans. But in the First Temple period, Judaism did not have a notion of life after death. It was only after the Persian conquest of Judea that the notion of life after death crept into Judaism from the Persian religion Zoroastrianism, and which incidentally became the core central belief and goal of Christianity. And during this period, Greek and Aramaic became the lingua franca of Jews. Throughout the arc of history, we were distinguished by not having a single language. Elias Bickerman, who's probably a well-known Jewish historian from the 20th century, who's probably best known for the claim that the Seleucid Greek suppression of Judaism in Jerusalem that led to the Maccabee uprising, that the instigation of it came from Hellenist Jews. His views on that have been pretty much debunked and refuted by much better scholarship. However, he did make the observation that I think is worth remembering, and that is that Jews represented the only people in the long course of history who retained their cohesiveness and their values and their civilization without retaining a single language. Hebrew was spoken in an earlier era, Aramaic in Judea, Arabic in Spain. The exiles from Spain of 1492 went to a great extent to the Ottoman Empire, which welcomed them. And they retained for 500 years 15th century Spanish as the lingua franca of the Jewish community. A large concentration of these exiles from Spain landed in Saloniki, which today is called Thessalonica. And they represented a very large minority of Saloniki and represented major participants in the life. The port of Saloniki, the lingua franca on the port was Ladino, and the port was closed on Shabbos because the stevedores were all Jewish. The CEO of Pfizer, Mr. Borla, is a descendant and a survivor of children of survivors of the Holocaust who came from the Jewish community in Saloniki. And Yiddish, it was 15th century Hochdeutsch, and over years and years of use involved the accumulation of Hebrew words, English words, Polish words, Russian words, etc. And so Jewish scholars were constantly reinterpreting our traditions while maintaining a kind of authentic core. You know, if you look at the book of Ruth, from Jewish history's perspective, from the mythology of our people, Ruth says to her stepmother, after her husband dies, I will follow you where you go, your people will be my people, your God will be my God. And Ruth is the mythological grandmother of King David, the archetype hero of the biblical era. And if you go to a later period in time, Judaism and Jews actually proselytized. Under Alexander Yanai, the Hashmonite kingdom conquered Edom and converted the residents of Edom by the sword. Yet today, if you ask Jews if they seek out converts, the answer is no. Why? Because on the one hand, while Jews spent many years seeking out converts, there were difficulties during the Roman period. The first one is Judea was a conquered nation in the Roman Empire, and having someone convert to a conquered nation was not a particularly good move. I mean, it was probably not politically correct. Secondly, if you were a man, converting to Judaism was no small trick. in an era without modern sanitary medicine and anesthesia. Yet when Jews really stopped pursuing converts was when Christianity took over the Roman Empire. And under the Roman Empire, the conversion away from Christianity became a capital offense, and Jews ceased looking for converts in the Roman Empire. In Muslim Spain, Jewish scholarship and culture reflects the Arab norms. You know, Maimonides, the greatest Jewish and rabbinic scholar, whose stature was so outstanding that the expression was always "Moshe leMoshe ein k'Moshe." From Moses to Moses, there was none like Moses. And Maimonides prepared and wrote a 14-volume commentary on rabbinic law called the Mishnah Torah, or referred to colloquially as the Yad HaChazakah because of the 14 volumes. And what does the Yad HaChazakah represent? It represents a synthesis between rabbinics and the Aristotelian philosophy that was current and preserved and studied in Muslim Spain in the era of Abd ar-Rahman. And how does it manifest itself? You know, what is Aristotle remembered for? He's remembered for the golden mean. And what do you find in the Yad HaChazakah? You find this constant reference to the Shvil HaZahav, the golden path or the golden way. The Shvil HaZahav is the correct answer to the question of what are you supposed to do? When you sit down to eat, how much should you eat? Do you eat so little so you leave the table hungry? Or do you eat so much that you're stuffed and overfilled? Well, the correct answer is you eat enough not to be hungry, but not enough to be overstuffed. You know, that is the Shvil HaZahav. How do you dress? You don't dress in rags and you don't dress ostentatiously. You dress in an acceptable way that is neither shabby nor ostentatious. That is the Shvil HaZahav. When you look to the Jewish poetry, Ibn Gabriel, Yehuda Halevi, this is poetry that reflected the style and meter of Arabic poetry written at the time. Arabic poetry was based upon how the Quran was read, and Jewish poetry, written in Hebrew, in fact, mimicked the style and meter of the Arabic poetry. So when you read Yehuda Halevi, you're supposed to read it to be true to its original source as Tzion Halo, Tish Ali, Lish Lomasi Raich. No one today would read it that way if you studied it in school, but that in fact was how it was read, was originally written. And during the medieval time when mysticism and false messiahs popped up, mysticism and false messiahs popped up in Judaism. And you had then, of course, in the 17th century, the emergence of Hasidut, which in my view represented a serious influence of Christianity on Jewish practice. One of the basic tenets of Judaism was always there is no intercessor between you and your God. Everyone has a direct connection. However, the Hasidim developed the concept of the Rebbe or the Tzaddik, who in fact became an intercessor between the Hasid and God, in the same way that the priest is the intercessor between the individual Christian and God, and the same way that the saints are the intercessors between the individuals and God. And yeah, I always tell my Christian friends that they really want to understand what what Christianity was like when Christianity was a Jewish sect. They should be, by the way, how much time do we have before I forget? How much more time do we have?
We'll wrap up around 12:15 and then do questions then.
Okay, so I got to move along quickly. I won't give you my spiel about how I tell my Christian friends they should go study Lubavitch to see what Christianity was like when it was a Jewish sect, which brings us to the 19th century and the emergence of Zionism. The two major currents in the 19th century were nationalism and socialism. Nationalism emerged for the first time after the French Revolution. The conservative powers in France mobilized to crush the revolution and its values of liberty, equality, fraternity, which were a threat to the conservative order. And to defend the revolution, the call went out to do something that had never been done before: the mobilization of the French nation in defense of the revolution. And they succeeded in conquering whole swaths of Europe, and with them they brought the concepts of and the values of the revolution. The values of liberty, equality, and fraternity were spread by nationalism in the 19th century, which bore no relation to nationalism in the 20th century. The second great movement was socialism. And Zionism, in fact, was a reflection of a response to anti-Semitism and a reflection of these two great movements: the liberal nationalism of the 19th century and the socialism of the 19th century. And the Zionist movement had two major movements. One was the general Zionists, who basically viewed the way to get a Jewish state was to negotiate and get approval from the leaders of the major powers and the major nations. And the socialist Zionists, who believed that the way to achieve the Jewish state was through building the institutions in the land of Israel. The Balfour Declaration and then the British Mandate was, of course, the success of general Zionism. But the building of the Yishuv, the building of the proto-state, the building of the institutions and the viability of that community in the land of Israel was basically the work of the labor Zionist movement. The religious movements played virtually no role in the birth of Israel. The Haredim rejected the very notion, and the religious Zionists, if you look at the numbers of kibbutzim that were created, there were 300 kibbutzim roughly, and 12 of them are religious Zionist kibbutzim. And so the birth of Israel was in effect the outgrowth of the second Aliyah. From 1880 to 1914, 2 million Jews left what was the Russian Empire and moved to the United States. 50,000 Jews left the Russian Empire and moved to the land of Israel. Half of them stayed. And from those 25,000, we had the birth of the culture and values and life and institutions of the Jewish community in Israel, the Yishuv. And from that community grew the institutions that enabled the Yishuv in 1948, and actually 1947, after the passing of the UN resolution, to emerge from the mandate as a viable state with institutions of governance, healthcare, education, and defense. David Ruderman is on this call. We were both on the 1961-62 year course. David, of course, became one of the great Jewish scholars of our era. And we all went to Israel at a point in time where the values of the Yishuv, the culture of the Yishuv was still strong and still represented Israel. For the first 25 years of the history of the state of Israel, the labor movement, the labor Zionist movement represented, in effect, the development of the state of Israel and the values of the state of Israel. However, today, if you look at today, Israel is entirely different. The country has become an economic powerhouse. It's a defense powerhouse. It's a technology powerhouse. From the egalitarian state that existed from 1948 through 1970, Israel today has an income distribution that's worse than the United States. Israel has more billionaires per capita than the United States. And sadly, if the polls are correct, only about half of the population of Israel still supports universal conscription for Tzahal. And so when you look at Israel today, it represents a country and a society that's very different from the vision of the founders and leaders of the Yishuv, and the vision of the founders of the state and the leaders of the state in its first 25 years of existence. And I think that understanding how this has changed calls into question what makes Israel today a Zionist state, and what makes Zionism today, or what should Zionism today to consist of. You know, when we were young, I would say the interest in Israel was not all that broad. It was only after the '67 war that there was this explosion of support for Israel in the Jewish community. And interestingly enough, it was a very kind of unidimensional definition. Whatever Israel wanted, that's what we would support. And so you have this evolution of Israel from a state that embodied the culture of the Zionist movement to a state that, in fact, looks like a state of looks like any other state in many respects. The fact that 80% of the population is Jewish and the language of the country is Hebrew does not, by definition, make it a Zionist state, because that certainly depends on the culture and the values. When you look at the role of religion today, you have something that is the result of an electoral system and changes in the population. The Yishuv that represented these pioneering values was very small. In 1948, Israel had maybe 600,000 Jews. In the 1930s, maybe 350,000. And immediately after the creation of the state, there was a mass influx of Olim. 250,000 refugees from the Holocaust, 1 million refugees from the Edot Mizrach. In the 1990s, 1 million Russians fleeing the collapse of the Soviet Union. And you had, on this very small base of labor Zionist leadership, the imposition of literally millions of new immigrants who had no Zionist identification as defined by the labor Zionist movement that led the creation of the state of Israel on the ground. And you had people coming from civilizations without a great opening to the Enlightenment and without democratic experience. And so the survival, I used to view this somewhat differently until Trump got elected. And I used to think democracy in America was much stronger than it turned out to be. But the survival of democracy in Israel was, in fact, a great miracle. And but at the same time, the institutions and the change in the demographics, the birth rate of Haredim has given Haredi religion a terribly powerful authoritarian control over Jewish identity and Jewish practice in Israel, which is antithetical to what the Zionist movement expected and what the Yishuv represented. So what does this all mean with respect to what a Zionist movement should be today? My own view is Israel is an economic powerhouse. It doesn't need charity from world Jewry. World Jewry giving charity to Israel makes world Jewry feel good, but it's not essential to the success of Israel. Israel is a political powerhouse. I mean, just this weekend, Naftali Bennett flew to Moscow to meet with Putin for the purpose of trying to end the war in the Ukraine. And he did that with the blessing and support of the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of Germany, and the President of the Ukraine. And after the meeting with Putin, he flew to Germany to meet with the Prime Minister of Germany. And so the viability of Israel doesn't hang on the political support of Jews in the United States. So what does that mean in terms of Zionism? What does that mean in terms of the youth movement? What does that mean in terms of what we should be thinking about, what we should be focusing on? And what should young Judea in particular be thinking about and focusing on? And I would say when you look back at this long arc of Jewish history that I painted with a broad brush earlier in the presentation, one of the things that was clear was Judaism survived and evolved because the Jewish community had a strong foundation in Jewish literature, Jewish custom, Jewish text, Jewish midrash, and it was able to assimilate the best of the outside world into the authentic core of what Judaism represents. If you look at the evolution of Judaism in the United States, we're at the point where Jewish education is, well, when it used to be called a mile wide and an inch deep. I'm not even sure it's a mile wide any longer, but it's very thin. Understanding of the authentic Jewish core is limited. If you go to Israel, the predominance of Haredim in religious practice, although the current government, of course, is weakening that to some extent, I think represents a stultification of Jewish history rather than a perpetuation of it. And so I think the mandate for youth movement is, and I'll tell you in just a second.
Yeah, so sorry. Wrap up soon.
Yeah, I would say it is a commitment to Jewish education and an understanding of the assimilation and integration of the best of the world with the authentic core of Judaism. And this is what we should hold as a vision for Israel. This is what we should hold as a vision for the United States, a Jewish community. And this is what we should hold as a mission that has real value. Know the Jewish core, be Jewishly literate, so you in fact can represent and sustain and perpetuate the arc of Jewish history.
Thank you so much, Avi. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up right now. We do have time for one or two quick questions before you head to your next room. If anyone wants to jump in.
David Ruderman, you must have something to say.
David, do you want?
You're on mute.
I'm muted. There I am. No, I'm not. Whatever I'm going to say to you, I'm going to say off camera. But to correct some little small things. But it was really well done. I wish we had more time for comment and questions about particularly the Zionist part, which I think are really very profound thoughts and things that we need to discuss much more rigorously than this kind of a framework, and could certainly be an entire session. But maybe they will come up in part when we talk about what is the Zionist youth movement in 2022. But anyway, Yisher Koach, Avi. It was a pleasure learning Jewish history from you.
Well, I gotta say, this is highly embarrassing because if you really want a lesson in Jewish history, David is the person you should go.
Forget it.
Hey, Avi. Hi, everyone. Nice to see some friends,
Hi, Joe.
old friends from a long time ago when we were together at camp. You were our madrichim. But let me ask you a question. Back in those days, we focused on the book, The Zionist Idea, which in essence brought in multifaceted approaches towards Israel, towards Zionism, et cetera. Would you say, going over those kinds of sources and looking at those resources, that they updated, and actually Gil Troy, I think, updated it, but it's as relevant today as it was back then to examine and measure Israel, measure our involvement, commitment, looking at multifaceted views as opposed to a very focused view?
No, I think, Joe, that's really a good point. When I say we have to study, we have to know the Jewish core, it means not just knowing the history of events, but it means understanding the intellectual history. And the Zionist idea in its original form and the introductory essay by Arthur Hertzberg was a phenomenally wonderful and important piece of work, because it really exposed us to the multiple dimensions of the evolution of the Zionist movement. And it gives us the opportunity to explore which of those speak to us today and should be brought to the fore, and which are important from a historical context. I mean, certainly, understanding them is part of the process of understanding our history.